It's about the process, it's about what happens along the way, the details of how we get to from one plot point to the next. Life is what happens when you're making other plans. That's really the theme of Middlemarch. That the way in which you plot out your life, that's actually exactly what didn't happen. like or at least 99% of what happens are all the kind of marginal details. And again, that's summed up in the title. Likewise, what I think Eliot emphasizes in the episode in Rome, which also contains some of the novel's most beautiful and famous writing, has to do with a aesthetic experience, just like we have been talking about. That is stories, the stories of life, stories of history, the way in which we make sense of history by giving causally coherent accounts of how things played out, actually hinge on these moments that don't make sense, where that are defined by conflict. And remember, Dorothy's experiencing something in spite of herself, this pagan pleasure. She doesn't want to feel. It's not, it's exactly what doesn't make sense for her character. But how life plays out, kind of again, while you're making other plans. So a theme of book one I suggested was Midland bred souls. That nature offers ways of organizing the accidents of life into meaningful personhood. But these are experiences that are hard to capture in the logical linear terms of narrative and language generally. And that's what leads to the kind of mistakes that Dorothea ran into, really misunderstanding one's own self. Dorothea has these iconoclastic ambitions to be wise, and she misinterprets them so bluntly, so literally. Like, oh, there's Casaubon. He's got a lot of books, so that he must be wise. So in book two, Eliot really begins to explore how art can organize the accidents that make up our actual experience, how art can speak to us intuitively. The experience of particular artworks is going to play a very crucial role, especially, of course, the Ariadne statue, but also the reference to the German Nazarene painters and the Pre-Raphaelite painters are sort of a subtext. Ladislaus' friend Naumann seems to represent this group. This is a style of painting. I would call it a very stylized realism. The Pre-Raphaelites reject the individualism of Raphael's paintings. This is something we've seen. Eliot rejects that concern with the supreme self. It might not seem so striking at first, but if you notice in Raphael's Madonna on the right, how much of the picture is taken up by skin, the individuated body. These are portraits of individuals, whereas these tend to be more like depictions of people in the landscape. It evokes the idea of a physiognomy in the fields. It has a holistic style. The whole frame is filled with figurative detail. Whereas again, here so much is consumed by the blankness of the particular individuals. Here, the human figure is stylistically integrated into the surrounding scene. For all this individuation, the Nazarenes or the Pre-Raphaelites would see it as dehumanizing for its, again, excessive concern for this, what Eliot calls the supreme self. So perceiving the world is about appreciating kind of environmental or social web of interaction. Eliot is interested in social identities that are most intimately, deeply defined by things they hold in common that are not individualized. Likewise, these are kind of mask like stylizations of recognizably real people, but also slightly cartoonish, like slightly anonymous and generic. They represent sides of all of us. We recognize truer aspects of ourselves in these shared types. So remember Eliot's account of Ruskin's realism. Attending to reality in a way that remolds our lives. So takes us out of ourselves, takes us out of the myths of sort of fake individualism, and connects us with deeper socially shared truths. This is what makes it like music. Music coordinates our feelings likewise. We participate in a kind of collective emotion when we and listen to music. A question I wanted to raise, or I raised in the discussion about whether Bulstrode is a caricature of a kind of miser Scrooge. By that, I don't mean to disparage Eliot's writing, um, but I want to ask if there might be a reason that, like, she's telling us something. So to say the argument between Vinci and Bulstrode is an example of this interplay of art and life. What I mean to say is that Vinci exhibits a kind of art rhetorical artistry, sort of like Miss Cadwallader does. He outmatches Bulstrode in his argumentation, um, and wit, and yeah, I think moral intelligence. Bulstrode is so blunt and black and white and intolerant. Um, and so Vinci, there's a power and a virtue, I think, in Vinci's ability to represent in his language a more complex reality, and make Bulstrode recognize it, despite his superior power. That's the thing. In reality, Bulstrode has this entitlement and prerogative to do what he wants and push people around. Indeed, Bulstrode pushes Lydgate around quite humiliatingly. Actually, disenfranchises Lydgate, or gets Lydgate to disenfranchise himself. He's so overpowered by the social concerns. He doesn't know how to deal with them. He doesn't know his own mind. And so he just puts off the decision until the last minute and then decides because of a really accidental circumstance of the moment, basically. The way he puts it may be offensive to others, but I shall not desist from voting with Bulstrode on that account. It's as if he doesn't know how to deal with social pressure. So his solution is just to be totally contrary. It's very immature, childish, and I think it's an aspect of Lydgate's character, which is his sort of inherited sense of entitlement, that it is a legacy of his aristocratic background, which he feels that the normal rules of society don't apply to him, and he acts that way, with the ironic consequence that he just gets totally pushed around by random social forces because he's too aloof to bother to understand them. He becomes a tool of them. Time has speeded up with modernity as the advent of the railroad underscores. So we belated historians must not linger. I, at least, have so much to do in unraveling certain human lots, certain human fates, particular, totally idiosyncratic, and seeing how they were woven and interwoven, that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web, and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. So it's this particular weave and interweave, just like those physiognomies of the fields. Another way of thinking about that is, she wants her book to be an aesthetic object rather than an explanation. She wants, like looking at an artwork or enjoying a scene in nature. The point is to appreciate it, even kind of fall in love with it for its own sake. What we're about, what characters are about, is not an intellectual choice, but and it draws from an aesthetic experience, as she describes here with Lydgate. For all his intellectual idealism and science and politics, come back to basically an aesthetic experience. Eliot writes, most of us who turn to any subject with love remember some morning or evening hour when we got on a high stool to reach down an untried volume, or sat with parted lips listening to a new talker, or for the very lack of books began to listen to the voices within, as the first traceable beginning of our love. Spontaneous, intuitive insight into oneself, what I'm about. That's what aesthetic experiences offer. Um, and Eliot emphasizes here it has to do with form. That's really what captures Lydgate's imagination. It's the form of the valve. He knew what a valve like doors were, and that he understood that word and that connection. Then he picks up this book and reads it in application to the heart, and he's that sort of connection fires his imagination, his intellectual, and gives him an intellectual passion. He was not much acquainted with valves of any sort, but he knew that valvae were folding doors, and through this crevice came a sudden light, startling him with his first vivid notion of finely adjusted mechanism in the human frame. Eliot a little bit uses the metaphor of the valve here. Through the crevice, the light comes, to narrate his this epiphany. Um, it's like a romantic symbol. It is like the physiognomy in the land. It's its own explanation. It doesn't explain in an impersonal way. It invites the reader to insight into the Lydgate's own vision of the symbol, how that valve structures not just the heart, but his heart in a way, like insofar it structures his passion, his intellectual passion, and hence also the story of the birth of that passion is structured by a valve, light shining through valve-like crevice. Not hard to map the valve structure onto Lydgate's name, and it's another kind of feature of this novel is a lot of characters have names that tell us something, tell us in a not very subtle way about their certain characteristics. I feel like that's a Dickensian detail too, and it's something to think about for sure. Is like what's up with Eliot's kind of signaling what to think about these characters. Um, it's almost like she's suggesting their reducibility to these concepts. Miss Noble, Mr. Fairbrother. How does that relate to this insistence on this particular web, specific human lots? If people are sort of wearing labels like in a allegorical morality play, Eliot narrates in the same manner the scene of Ladislaw falling in love with Dorothea. It's organized around a vision, emphatically aesthetic vision. So emphatic it goes back to Cleopatra, like Antony's passion for Cleopatra. It's so unique and individual. In order to understand it, we have to share it. We have to participate in it. In order to read it, Ariadne represents a pagan, mythology. Ariadne's thread. She rescues Theseus, maybe, but then is abandoned by him. And sleeping Ariadne represents this moment where, after she's been abandoned, but then she's seen napping by Bacchus, who falls in love with that vision of her sleeping. So it's apt, it's fitting in this formal way with Dorothea's transition from Casaubon to Ladislaw, even as she's not looking at it, even as she seems kind of oblivious to it. That's actually the theme of the Ariadne statue, is this kind of self-containment, this complex self-containment. I mean, she's an image of seductiveness. That's why Bacchus falls in love with her. But also isolation, abandonment, sort of existentially forlorn. This complexity again, this sort of tension and ambiguity, pushing and pulling. The reclining Ariadne, then called Cleopatra, lies in the marble voluptuousness of her beauty. I love the complexity of that phrase. Like, voluptuous, it evokes the opposite of marble, and of her beauty, it personifies, animating the statue, the drapery folding around her with petal-like ease and tenderness. Part of what's at stake here, I want to suggest, is an evocation of sexual passion within the very limited restrictions of Victorian prose. Eliot here is relying on our imaginative reconstruction of this visual scene and all of its erotic subtext, so that she doesn't have to write it, because she can't write it. They were just in time to see another figure standing against a pedestal near the reclining marble, a breathing, blooming girl. So you can hear the echoes here, just what I was saying about the personification, the blooming, whose form not shamed by the Ariadne. That's interesting too, not shamed. That could be read in two ways. She feels no shame, or the Ariadne does not put her to shame. And that's very evocative, sexually in both senses. She has a voluptuousness, not shamed by the Ariadne, and as well, she is not shamed by that voluptuousness herself. She's self-possessed in her beauty, as the Ariadne is. She was not looking at the sculpture, probably not thinking of it. Her large eyes were fixed dreamily on a streak of sunlight which fell across the floor. But she became conscious of the two strangers, who suddenly paused as if to contemplate the Cleopatra. Oh, I love that, how it's the Cleopatra. She was not shamed by the Ariadne, but the Cleopatra, who does that apply to? As if to contemplate the Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is already like a hypothesis, as if it could be Dorothea, it could be the Ariadne. Cleopatra is her own myth of a visionary, seductive appeal. Contemplating Cleopatra is as much about self-reflection as it is about observation of her. She reflects your desire. In this sense, she's an image of aesthetic experience, a symbol of desire in general. As Antony says, she's infinitely variable because desire is alive. And changeable itself. Ladislaw gets annoyed here when Naumann refers to some art theory to contrast Dorothea and Ariadne here. What do you think of that for a fine bit of antithesis? There lies antique beauty, not corpse-like even in death, but arrested in the complete contentment of its sensuous perfection. So that's what he's saying about so wonderful about the statue is it evokes the stillness that is its own theme, entirely self-composed, and contrasts this with the dynamism of Christian passion. And here stands beauty in its breathing life, with the consciousness of Christian centuries in its bosom. But she should be dressed as a nun, Naumann concludes. So I just want to quickly recall that aesthetic contrast between the classical ideal of self-possession, complete stillness that is underscored by the permanence of the marble itself. This timeless ideal, like the Platonic forms, and how this is contrasted with Christian passion, the beating heart, the experience of being in a body and bearing witness to divinity, rather than embodying it thoroughly oneself. It's also Christian irony, I think, mystery, grace, that we infer beyond the material presence of the visual artwork itself. It's a movement of mind, a reflective self-consciousness, a dynamism that's something more than what you see on the surface. Whereas here, everything is on the surface. It's all about the perfection of the surface. So Nauman's, oh, she should be dressed as a nun, in a way betrays the point that he's making about this dynamism. He wants her to kind of symbolically pigeonholed in a way that irritates Ladislaw. But more generally, more broadly, Ladislaw is bearing witness to his love here. The dynamism that he is experiencing, he is bearing witness to. I think comes out in his objection here. And this woman who you've just seen, how would you paint her voice? But her voice is much diviner than anything you've seen of her. So he's talking literally. That's what he loved about her from their first meeting. This leads to this his acknowledgement of falling in love. He felt as if something had happened to him with regard to her. That's, I think, very precisely with regard to her. What happened to him had to do with regarding her. It's a visionary experience, just like Bacchus bearing witness to or falling in love with Ariadne. Dorothy's dreamily looking off into the distance in this pose, her cheek pillowed on her hand, crystallizes her grace like the Mona Lisa smile. The readers are left to experience Will's experience of love as a mystery. What makes it transformative, what precipitates the romance narrative is itself beyond narration. All you can do is point to it. I mean, this is a great example of just pointing rather than narrating. He's just pointing at the statue. That's what it was. That's what falling in love was. It is having this vision. So what is the crocodile like? It shapes her like itself, and it's as broad as it hath breadth, and it's just so high as it is, and it moves with its own organs. It lives by that which nourisheth it, and the elements, once out of it, it transmigrates. So it's the ultimate, you had to be there. We're getting ensnarled and tangled in a web of experience. We're getting sutured into that rather than just reading about it. That's the vitality of the web, I think, of the social web. It goes beyond something that you can account for in a detached way. So she's describing in this chapter Ladislaw falling in love, and so a destiny that is going to get narrated in the remainder of the book, all the rest of those 6 books to go. But she also says something here about the whole rest of Dorothea's life. A mood gets set here for Dorothea, sort of the forlorn side of Ariadne. It's capturing that mood. Even so, we see the erotic spectacle Cleopatra through Will's eyes, but here we see kind of existential loneliness, the mood that stays with Dorothea for the rest of her life. So it's a fatality that's getting narrated here through magic lantern pictures, so these dream images, maybe what she's seeing when she's looking dreamily at the sunbeam. Our moods are apt to bring with them images which succeed each other like the magic lantern pictures of a doze. And in certain states of dull forlornness, Dorothea all her life continued to see the vastness of St. Peter's, the huge bronze canopy, and the red drapery which was being hung for Christmas, spreading itself everywhere like a disease of the retina. Really powerful final image there. Christmas drapery like a disease of the retina. I think it does justice to the kind of existential loneliness or forlornness of Dorothea's mood here, um, in its blasphemy, like its secular disenchantment. The Christmas symbolism, the Christian symbolism, it becomes a disease of the retina, totally disenchanted. An awareness of her mortality, um, aware of feeling that's going to stay with her for her whole life. This is a deep feeling of herself, deep awareness of her kind of existential loneliness. Um, it's pretty amazing. This mood of Dorothea's, um, it's not it's the experience of loneliness, but it's also an experience of humanity in general, not just her particular self, but humanity in general, which is described in perhaps the most famous passage of Middlemarch altogether, um, which describes the tragedy in the very fact of frequency. That's to say, um, the experience of disappointment, the way in which reality replaces the imaginary. It's not unusual, and it's hard to be moved by what's not unusual. This is so common. It's the regular story of every life. Recognizing human sorrow at scale, at the scale of the human population, and then the imagery that Eliot uses here, it even suggests an environmental awareness. It's not just about human sorrow, but a cosmic sorrow. That element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of frequency has not yet wrought itself into the coarse emotion of mankind, and perhaps our frames could hardly bear much of it. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. So another irony here is, even as Eliot's pointing it out as something we cannot hear, she's trying to make us alive to it, making us hear the silence differently, as an absence of this roar. It's not telling us what the roar is, but just attuning us to its absence. A spiritual conceit, kind of cosmic sorrow, cosmic disappointment. And it's interesting that it's a figure of frequency. It has to do with large numbers at scale, and that's a theme elsewhere in the novel. Statistics. She's thinking in concrete terms about as much as she's touching on this sort of existential, sublime self-consciousness, she's also referring to a concrete empirical fact of frequency, the fact of the multitude of humanity, the kind of incomprehensible numbers that is especially pronounced in the modern world. We're always struggling with that conundrum that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, that we can't grasp large numbers. And yet large numbers sort of define the deepest truths of our world. And I think this painting evokes this mix of emotion, the intense intimacy with a sense of kind of impersonal or generic frequency or commonality, a sort of generic picture of personal emotion. The picture of Christ as a child, King Arthur's death, these sort of legendary mythological themes populated with semi-realistic stylized human figures. It's a famous pre-Raphaelite painting, The Beguiling of Merlin. And here's Cleopatra. I think of these as the magic lantern pictures that we see in a doze that Dorothea refers to. They're pictures of emotions that transcend the individual possessor of the emotion. That our deepest selves are a kind of social self that's not limited to our individual identity, with sort of a shared, again, fabric web. We can see each other, these kind of stylized types. So it's interesting to notice here, going back to Lydgate's story, that part of his ambition as a doctor is to be a statistic. He wants to, like Dorothea, he has this consciousness of the frequency, the scale of human experience in large numbers. And so that what matters in life is affecting, participating in this statistical level of reality. So I think that's a very, very interesting characterization of heroism, moral heroism. It's an awareness of statistics. I mean, it really speaks to us now in a day of climate change. That the reality, the urgent reality we have to address exists on this statistical level. It's true in terms of climate change. It's true in terms of social realities of racism and sexism. So thinking of how we fit into these statistical realities and responding and living accordingly is, I think, very urgent and I think prescient of Eliot here to describe Lydgate in these terms. Considering that statistics had not yet embraced a calculation as to the number of ignorant doctors which absolutely must exist in the teeth of all changes, it seemed to Lydgate that a change in the units was the most direct mode of changing the numbers. He meant to be a unit who would make a certain amount of difference toward that spreading change which would one day tell appreciably upon the averages, and in the meantime have the pleasure of making advantageous difference to the viscera of his own patients. Again, very modern ethical self-consciousness, and again, strikingly, ironically contrasted with his short-sightedness in his personal life. What's interesting here is the way in which I think he is seeing himself as a unit, an impersonal, generic doctor. That represents his ethical challenge, to see himself on that generic, impersonal level. A perspective, I think, like we get in these Nazarene and pre-Raphaelite painters.